Okay, welcome back, everyone, and thank you for sticking around. I know it's a Friday afternoon.
Yeah, Friday afternoon, wow.
I know, this is real dedication, and we really appreciate it. We do have a reception afterwards with drinks, if that will kind of inspire you to remain seated for what we hope is a challenging discussion. My name is Beth Veras. I'm a senior fellow here at Brookings and co-director of the Brookings-LSE Project on Internal Displacement. This is the last event we'll organize as the project. It is our 165th event that we've held here at Brookings. And when I went back and looked over the range of issues on which we've organized events, you know, it's everything from Darfur to Gaza to Libya. In many ways, we've been the humanitarian arm of Brookings as well, in terms of trying to bring up the human dimension of the impact of foreign policies and other issues that affect people. So it's been a real pleasure to be here these years, and looking forward to this last session that we're organizing. It's going to look at the future challenges for work with IDPs. You know, we just heard a little while ago some of the stories of how this project came to be and how IDPs made it onto the international agenda and the legal framework was established, and some of the challenges of working with national governments. Certainly it's been a remarkable story, and I think, as Martin Indyk said, it's been one of a human rights success story of the past decades. But much remains to be done. The number of IDPs in the world is at an all-time high, 38 million displaced by conflict, more displaced by disasters and development projects. And we may hear about some of the difficulties in counting those displaced for other reasons. I can't remember a time when we've seen so many simultaneous mega crises. My sense is the international humanitarian system is close to the breaking point, just trying to deal not only financially with responding to large numbers of crises, but in terms of energy and creativity and staffing. It seems like every time I go someplace, I'm hearing about our education expert from Pakistan was pulled out to go work in northern Iraq for a while, and I've been in Central African Republic and now have to go to South Sudan. The number of crises is really, really overwhelming. Institutionally, we heard about some of the positive developments with UNHCR taking on IDPs more. We have a whole cluster system that's emerged in large part because of the awareness of the gap to deal with the issue of IDPs. The institutional structure has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, and still there are gaps. Still there are cases where international institutions cannot or choose not to respond to IDPs because it's not my mandate, it's not so important, somebody else is doing it, so-and-so, a particular personality may not give it the importance it deserves. There's some confusion about how we address people displaced for different reasons. Are those displaced by disasters facing the same kinds of needs as those displaced by conflict? Where do development projects fit into this? The whole issue of development-induced displacement is a politically very sensitive one for many governments. And I think for some good reasons, the mandate has sort of tiptoed around the issue of development-induced displacement, because to confront a government such as Brazil or India or Bangladesh or the United States about displacing people for development projects can raise a host of different and sometimes uncomfortable questions. There's another group of challenges related to where IDPs live. You know, humanitarians have gotten quite comfortable with running camps. You know how to set up a camp and ensure that services are provided. And when services aren't provided, you know who is responsible. There's a certain degree of accountability that comes with camps. But when people are living dispersed in communities, it becomes more difficult to identify them, to figure out what kind of assistance they need, and what kind of assistance they need in relationship to host populations. You know, should IDPs be singled out? Do they have needs that are specific to their displacement when everyone in a given community may be poor? So the challenge of dealing with IDPs living in non-camp settings, not just in urban areas, sometimes in very small villages and questions of visibility and targeting and assessments and counting all become more difficult when IDPs are dispersed among communities. Perhaps the biggest challenge is one that was raised in the last panel, and that is the fact that displacement drags on for years and years and decades and decades. How do we get a handle on protracted displacement? What can be done rather than simply lament the fact that people have been displaced for far too long? Are there new and creative ways that this protracted displacement, which I think is really a scandal, when you talk to people who've been displaced and whose parents were displaced and whose children face a lifetime of displacement. We need to take this very, very seriously. We have a distinguished panel today, this afternoon. We're going to begin with Alfredo Zamudio, who's the director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. In the whole world, there really have been two institutions working exclusively on IDPs, Brookings and IDMC. We've worked very closely together over the years, trying to complement our efforts, pooling resources, sometimes lamenting developments in the world together. And so we're delighted to have you, and really quite touched that you came all this way to be with us this afternoon, Alfredo. But Alfredo, tell us a little bit about what the future is for work on sovereignty issues. Are the issues all solved now that we've got the guiding principles and so on?
Hi. First of all, thank you, and thank you to the panelists. It's Friday afternoon. I am grateful that you are here to listen to us. Elizabeth, first of all, congratulations from the team in Geneva. Thanks to Brookings, thanks to everyone here in Washington who have done a marvelous job to do this pioneering work during all these years. It requires stamina and knowledge, and you have both in great magnitude. Has the situation changed because we have a legal tool, a legal framework that can be applied by countries? Let me tell you a little story. Once in 1994 and 95, I met a woman in Bosnia, and she told me, I know the war is over, or is about to be over. I think it was at the end of 95. But she said, in my head, I hear still the bombs. When I close the eyes, the bombs are still in there. So when we discuss about protracted displacement and to change that situation, we need to understand the individuals' feelings, emotions, the compassion that we need to understand for what's happening with them. The legal frameworks tell national governments, you have a responsibility, and because your responsibility, you have also the capacity to act. But how do we make governments to see the fellow citizens with compassion? That is, sometimes it's possible, sometimes it is impossible, because national governments are the cause of internal displacement in certain situations. In other situations, they don't have the capacity to respond or to protect. Those are the actions or the situations where we can work together with national governments and use the legal frameworks and use the capacity to work for the benefit of those who are displaced. Challenges ahead of us is that imagine a room, which is the displacement room, the stock of internal displacement. That room is getting more and more crowded. There are less and less doors available to those people in that room where they can go out of that situation. One of the challenges in front of us is that because people have been staying for 15, 20, 25 years waiting for restitution of land, waiting for justice, the international community may be tempted to say, open the pressure on national governments to say, because you have been waiting so long, we need to change your status. You are not longer an IDP. You are something else. Therefore, the situation, it has to be observed very carefully. What is the future in front of us? The volume of internal displacement is growing. We have heard 38 million people internally displaced until December last year, 11 million people only in 2014. That means one person internally displaced every 3 seconds in 2014 by conflict and violence. Then add on that disaster-induced displacement. And on those situations where disasters is compounded by conflict, like in the Sahel, you have drought, you have floods, and conflict. So the future in front of us is complicated, to say it like that. It's not as complicated as the US may never win this, the World Cup in football. It may happen sometime, but it requires some efforts. It requires some acknowledgement that it has to improve. And the dialogue has improved. I have been in this business and trying to understand the language of this since I first became an internally displaced in 1973 in Chile. And then I approached the ICRC. My father was in prison, and the ICRC said, you are not affected, your father is. I was a 12-year-old boy, unaccompanied child, expelled from my house, but in the eyes of the international community at that time, I was not a victim. That has changed. We have legal tools and methodologies that acknowledge us and help us to see. But then do we act on what we see? That is one of the challenges in front of us. And in the IDMC we are the weather center of this. We are always telling you the bad news, but we are also trying to identify the policies that work. Just let me use one more minute. And we produced a document for the Sendai Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Japan in March. We analyzed data since 1970 to 2013 using probabilistic risk. The same that insurance companies use, and you in the US, you know everything about how good the insurance companies are to say risk. So we used this methodology and we found 5 main drivers for an internal displacement by disasters. Those 5, people say, oh, climate change is one, of course, one. Then unplanned settlements. Settlements in hazard-prone areas, unequal distribution of wealth, and lack of governance or fragile states. So of those 5 drivers, 4 are man-made policies or situations that can change. If we address those things, we can reduce the vulnerability and affectation of people, and internal displacement by disaster can drastically be reduced. The same can be applied for some of the situations by conflict. It is about natural resources, it's about livelihoods, it's about goods, it's about jobs, it's about political rights, and those are policies that can change. So in front of us, I see an increasing number of difficulties, but it has not been static in the last 20 years. It has moved forward.
And so we can expect to continue moving forward? You want to go on record saying this, Alfredo?
Yes, I would like to go on record and say we are going to move on forward because we have, look at the forum here, you have a huge amount of young people who are taking over, learning, being capacitated, and and taking over this situation and learning how to do this. So I think the international community has changed, but it's difficult, and I am very happy to hear what UNHCR said, that it is something that a responsibility that UNHCR is taking. I know also the Global Protection Cluster is moving forward to do more on legal frameworks to help national governments on that. We are very happy to see that. And we need to know more, and also because national governments is not the enemy. National governments are the tool for the solutions, to durable solutions on this. We need to understand how do we create a dialogue with national governments.
Thank you. We'll turn now to Niels Harold, who's a displacement specialist at the World Bank, has been working on these issues for many years. And one of your calls has always been, let's stop seeing displacement just as a humanitarian issue, but see it as a development issue, and calling for the need for a paradigm change. What are your thoughts now, Niels, as you look forward on looking at displacement as a development issue.
I'm pretty stubborn, so my thoughts are about the same. I think being here in the Brookings institution reminds me of some of the things I have done in the past, and also listening to Francis Deng earlier. Soon I will join the extinguished group that he was referring to when I retire from the bank in a couple of months. But I was part of the Brookings process that was led by Ogata and Wolfenson, and Michel is here. He was partner in crime too, and it was a very important issue, but it sort of fizzled a little bit. And I think one of the reasons was that it was a little bit top down, and then 9/11 happened, and other priorities came to high politics. So when I joined the bank to do something else 10 years ago, a few years after, I saw the opportunity to maybe it would be better if we started to talk about displacement from the inside of a development institution. So I established a program that is called the Global Program on Forced Displacement in the bank to try and get the bank to more systematically address the issues of forced displacement, be that conflict-induced, that is, IDPs and refugees. And I think we have managed to get more traction on this, and I'll mention a couple of examples of what we have done, including recently I managed to get the now High Commissioner to actually meet with the President to talk about this issue again that Wolfenson and Ogata did, and hopefully this time I think we have a more solid bottom-up foundation to work with. I think when we talk about the scope that Alfredo mentioned, I think the key issue is that we are talking about close to 1% of the world's population affected by displacement. But maybe it's actually more than that, because we have to think about directly affected host populations and potential return populations as well, in often marginalized areas of countries that are suffering from chronic underdevelopment. And then we may talk about 5 or more % of the world's population, and making it therefore not just a small side issue. The average level of protracted displacement, I think, is now calculated as 17 years. Whether it is 17, 15, or 20, I think is not so important. The important thing is that it's long time. And we have seen very few solutions of large scale over the last 10, 15 years. And this means that the needs of those people and affected host communities becomes more developmental than humanitarian. But the policy shifts to change from the short-term handout mode to the longer-term consideration is hard to come by, and it's difficult. It's also tough choices for governments to take those decisions. But I think we were also supposed to talk about challenges here. And I think you mentioned that the issue of displacement is seen as a humanitarian issue predominantly. And I think that is still, to a large extent, a problem. And I think what is needed is sort of a mindset change to sort of to realize that the issue is political, it is security related, it is developmental, and it is humanitarian as well. And then you step back and say, now what do we do? And from the development perspective, that means we also have a role to play. And this is the work I've been working on in the bank to get development thinkers and planners to consider the issue, not because Guterres tells them to do so, but because it's a development issue. And that's where I think we have made some progress. And I'll mention a couple of examples. I think in terms of analytics, when I listened to the first panel, they talked about the lawyers on how they have prepared the guiding principles. On the basis of that, we were able to work with Walter on doing a piece of analytical work on the developmental implications of signing up to the Kampala Convention. So that governments that do ratify the Kampala Convention and sign it into law actually realize that it's not only a humanitarian activity they sign up to, because many of the clauses of the guiding principle, when you look at them, are more developmental in nature than humanitarian. But the mindset change, or the mindset challenge, is that people would talk about IDPs and Kampala Convention. Okay, that's humanitarian, so we give it to the humanitarians to deal with. And that's the first step in the wrong direction, or not only, but I mean, you have to also realize that there's more to it. I think I'm talking too long here. So let me see if I can just mention a couple of examples of bank work on this, and then stop if you like. I think in Azerbaijan, we have been working with the government from the bank side for a long time. And in the beginning, it was housing projects only, but we did a piece of analytical work on the potential for self-reliance of the IDPs. And now we have lending operations that promotes both self-reliance and housing support to IDPs, which is an improvement on how the original situation was. So this is an example of how a piece of economic analytics can lead to governments changing their policies and therefore how they deal with a displacement issue. We also spent many years, largely behind the scenes, working with colleagues in the Colombian government of documenting IDP land rights. That was a very important foundation for the victims reparation law that the present government is in the process of implementing. So this is another example. I mentioned the Kampala Convention. Just one more example before I stop. Some of you may know that the President and the Secretary General visited Africa on a number of occasions recently under what is known as regional initiatives. The program I manage in the bank, we managed to get a pillar of displacement into those regional initiatives and followed that up by pieces of analytical work that we undertook together with UNHCR, so that we created a different piece of work that could lead to a policy discussion with affected government that included both the World Bank's counterpart in government as well as the UNHCR's normal counterparts. And that's a little bit of a new way of doing business, because that hasn't really happened seriously anywhere before. It's too early to say what that will lead to, but I think in my experience with this could be good examples for a new way of doing business. But as Joel, I'm sure, would reminded me of, development solutions to displacement is not the magic number one. It's just one of the pieces, and it's not easy. But at least I think we have managed to we have improved the way that development actors think about it. And there are more development actors before, say, than 10 years ago, that are actually realizing that it's an issue for them because it's a development issue than before. I'll stop here and then can maybe, if question comes, we can.
Yeah, I wanted to press you a little bit, though. I mean, when you're approaching a development actor, what arguments work? Do you use a different jargon? Do you talk about resilience? Do you talk about long-term solutions, environment, gender? I mean, how do you need a different language?
Who approaches who?
Yeah, humanitarian approaches development actors. Why don't you guys get involved?
I think the main challenge is not so much what the humanitarians can say and do to the development actors. It's about development actors themselves getting it.
Right.
So for myself, I call it the oops factor. When I meet with a bank country manager or country director or sector leader and say, okay, you are working in country X and you have this many IDPs and you have this many refugees and so on, what are you doing about it? And that person says, I'm not doing anything about it. That's for UNHCR and Norwegian Refugee Council to handle. Right. And then I say, wait a minute. What about this and this and this? And what about the implications of protected displacement on poverty? And then you come with the whole argumentarium for why it is a development issue. And then often I say, I've never thought about it like that. Can we talk more? In case I want to do something, what should I do? And then the answer is often that you have to, in development work, you have to start with a piece of analytical work to make the developmental case for what you have to do, why you have to do something. Hence the studies we've done, or assessments we've done in the regional initiatives in Africa with UNHCR are pieces of development-led assessments that can be used by bank thinkers to then design operations. And we actually are in the process of designing some operations for refugees and host communities in the Great Lakes and the Horn right now.
And I like that phrase, the oops factor. I think that's something we should all aspire to.
It's very unbankish, but still.
Thanks. We turn now to Joel Charney, who's Vice President for Humanitarian Policy and Practice at Interaction, has followed IDP issues for many years and usually has something provocative to say. So let me just ask what you see as the future challenges for work in this area.
No, thanks, Beth. And I came to Washington in 2000, so I think, how many meetings were there? 185?
165.
65. Well, of those 165, I think I've been to about 90 of them at least. So, no, it's definitely the end of an era for the Brookings project to be laid down, and it's a privilege really to be on the podium and to be a part of this final session. And there were some giants on the stage, so I really appreciate being a part of this this final event. My sense on internal displacement is that we're losing momentum. I had a whole list. I'm not going to go into it for interest of time, but my gut sense is we peaked maybe in 2005, 2006 around the inclusion of the guiding principles in the World Summit document. But somehow, the humanitarian reform of 2005, as you'll recall, was actually driven by concern about internal displacement and the ineffective response. The cluster system was developed precisely to assign responsibility for key aspects of humanitarian response, again, with gaps related to internal displacement in mind. Now, I've been involved in work with the Interagency Standing Committee now for the last 4 years, pretty continuously since joining Interaction, and I'm struck that there's almost no mention of internal displacement. This is what Roberta was referring to. It's about vulnerability. It's about mainstreaming. It's about being objective about who's really in need. And while I appreciate that perspective, I think if there's still a case to say that internally displaced people have special needs, special problems that need to be recognized, that demand a special approach, I really feel that perspective is being lost right now. So I kind of divided what we need to do into 3 broad categories. One is we need more advocacy. There's no one right now really owns and is driving an advocacy agenda related to internal displacement. And I distinguish the research and the data function from the advocacy function. Yes, we need good statistics. Yes, we need objective research. But what's lacking is a body or a set of organizations that are taking that information and saying, based on this, these are the solutions, this is what we need to drive. And I just, absent kind of a rediscovery of advocacy and an advocacy agenda related to internal displacement, I think we're going to remain kind of stuck where we are. The second issue is sort of the institutional frameworks and arrangements. I mean, honestly, Beth, I think your statement about how our job is done and we're going to move on, I mean, we're going to miss Brookings. I mean, the mandate holder needs support. Let me just put it that way. So absent Brookings, where is that support going to come? Who's going to provide that support? I mean, Chaloka is already struggling, as was mentioned, as an unpaid individual to carry this mandate along with the full teaching load, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like Brookings is stepping down. I think that's going to create a vacuum that somehow is going to need to be filled. How, I'm not sure, but I think that's something we have to identify. I'm also convinced that I know all the bureaucratic reasons, but I think the fact is that moving the position from a representative of the Secretary General to a special rapporteur within the framework of the Human Rights Commission, that is a step down. It's a step backwards. It's a loss of prestige. It's a loss of access to the highest levels of the UN system. And I think, speaking of advocacy, we have to make that a major priority, that when Chaloka is replaced, he's replaced by someone who once again becomes a representative of the Secretary General, not a special rapporteur to the Human Rights Commission. And then, while this is somewhat related to institutional frameworks, I think the progress that we've made on the normative framework is indeed significant. But merely having a law in place, merely having the Kampala Convention doesn't necessarily lead to concrete implementation. There's a whole scope, I think, for technical support related to the normative framework. Again, who's going to provide that? I mean, I did see that, that mention of perhaps the Global Protection Cluster taking that up. That's great. Honestly, the GPC has a ton of problems right now. So, you know, I feel like, you know, something's going to have to supplement the work of the Global Protection Cluster to really make the national legislation real. And then finally, and this is perhaps the most sensitive issue that I'm going to raise, we need more operational effectiveness. And I come to this extremely reluctantly. I mean, I fought and advocated for at least 5 years for UNHCR to be recognized as the lead agency on internally displaced people, for HCR to embrace that mandate, you know, to take the lead globally as it relates to internal displacement. But it's just not working. Why is it not working? Because fundamentally, and the High Commissioner himself said this when challenged at a session at Interaction a few months ago, the core mandate for UNHCR is refugees and a refugee protection mandate. And when the refugee mandate conflicts with or causes issues related to the challenge of responding to internally displaced people, it's the refugee mandate that's going to win out every time. And I just saw a really stark example of this in Syria. In Syria, there are 26,000 Iraqi refugees who remain in the country and need protection. There are 4.5 million Syrians who are internally displaced. UNHCR in Syria has by far the most robust protection capacity in the country. That capacity is being devoted primarily to carrying out the mandate to care for and support 26,000 Iraqi refugees. And UNHCR is not providing the support and leadership that's needed on the internally displaced people of Syria, partially because they're afraid to offend the Syrian government. So, where does that leave us? Well, Hans-Jörg's bosses, Hans-Jörg's bosses at OCHA keep telling us to be bold. I don't know how bold truly we can be institutionally, But no, I'm not going to call for an IDP agency. That would be truly insane. But I do think we need to rethink overall responsibility for IDP protection. And if UNHCR can't carry it out, then we need to identify other ways for this to happen. We need to reconceptualize how IDPs are met by more effectively joining up the humanitarian response to internal displacement, perhaps under the leadership of the humanitarian country teams. I don't know. I mean, short of that, you do what, some crazy thing, I'm sure Shelley's like having a heart attack as I say this, but, you could really just say, let's just have UNHCR focus on legal protection for internally displaced people, and let's see how we can join up the capacity of UNHCR, WFP, and UNICEF together in responding to the concrete needs of people. Again, probably not politically doable, but again, it's just not working. It's not working in Syria, it's not working in Central African Republic, it's not working in South Sudan. So I just feel we need, especially in the context of the World Humanitarian Summit, we need to own that. We need to recognize it as a problem and see if we can come up with some creative solutions.
Thanks, and thanks too for your provocative comments. That's what I hope that you would provoke us to discuss. I mean, I think some of these issues about losing momentum and where do we go and institutional arrangements need to be.
So now you can press the Austin Powers like button, and I can like go down into the down into the pit of doom, and we can continue the conversation.
But this whole issue of institutional architecture and who does what and how, it really leads very much to you, Hans-Jörg Spielmeyer, Director of Policy at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. I mean, I remember you saying this, that a decade ago, OCHA had 30 staff people working in IDPs, and now there's 1/2 of one person. I mean, that's a dramatic change. As I've written before, are IDPs being mainstreamed into oblivion? What do you think, Hans-Jörg?
I have nothing to say on Joel's personal views on the interagency setup. Privately, perhaps, after we both get, and I have to explain to my bosses that I even part of this panel, now that no, look, I mean, I think perhaps just to echo much of what Joel said. I think it's a very mixed bag where we are right now, if I can say. But before I get into this, and I want to say that really from the bottom of my heart, just as Joel, I was really honored to be actually part of this, to see all these the forethinkers and forefathers of this. And I belong to whatever that second or third generation, but what I call the generation IDP. And when I entered the UN, OCHA, I remember Sergio Vera de Mello was about to go to the Wolfenson-Ogata dialogue, and one of my very first speeches that I had to draft in the first 2 or 3 weeks was actually on internally displaced, and there was no difficulty actually getting good advice because everyone was energized. I mean, that's what people would talk about. In fact, humanitarian crisis and IDPs was synonymous. The very fact that we have an emergency relief coordinator stems from the fact that there was an IDP crisis in northern Iraq, and in the middle of winter, some of you may remember, people could just not cross these additional 5 meters into Turkey, and no one actually had an answer. No one was responsible. No one knew how to refer to these people. And so someone said, well, someone needs to coordinate this. And that was the founding moment of what we call Resolution 46-182 of the Emergency Relief Coordinator of this interagency system that Joel just referred to. And so no doubt there has been much progress thanks to you, thanks to the rapporteurs and representatives and the leadership. But I do feel, as Joel, that there is backsliding, and there has been backsliding from a variety of angles. You alluded very much to the various agencies. It's very interesting that the ICRC, just in its latest strategic plan, for the first time in years, re-emphasized IDPs again. I think there's a collective loss of literacy on IDPs. We started calling these, because of pressure of governments, all sorts of things. And Roberta earlier referred to some of those things. We undermined the guiding principles and the very documents that guided us for the first 10 years, by not calling them IDPs anymore, and by emphasizing, I think, to an extent that is not healthy and not useful ultimately, delivery over addressing the very specific issues that actually make and keep IDPs IDPs. It has become very much about assistance, about delivering food, water, shelter, and other things, and not so much anymore about mobilizing the political energy of addressing some of these issues, of sitting with governments around the policies and the shifts that are necessary. So when we've had some discussions 2 years ago, starting to re-energize ourselves in OCHA, we had several people say, "What? I constantly talk about IDPs." Well, we mentioned the numbers, and we mentioned the figures, and we mentioned what we delivered to IDPs, but that is not the IDP response that was envisioned by the guiding principles and the spirit behind this. That was not about assistance, that was about rights and solutions. And I feel that we've lost a little bit of that. I also feel that in the intergovernmental process, there has been backsliding. I mean, you refer to advocacy. I mean, generally speaking, around rights, protection, IDP issues, and so on, where is the outrage? Where is the leadership on this outrage? It's been left and owned by us, the technical agencies, by organizations, rather than by politicians. Where is that leadership on some of these issues at the very senior level that political solutions require? Mobilizing the monies. And we see some of that in the various intergovernmental forums at the United Nations. At the Security Council, if you have references to IDPs, it's formulaic. It's like, comma, including IDPs, women, children, and these types of things that we've gotten used to. But there is no real content, there's no consideration anymore to it. There is no resolution that I can remember in recent years that really reaffirms the right to return, that calls upon member states or affected states, host states, to get on with policy shifts or strategies or action plans, and or sets even expectations on timeframes. A lot of things that we do on security sector reform and other operational areas, but it's become very formulaic. And lastly, the SDG process, the Sustainable Development Goals. Niels referred a little bit to this. I mean, the report that prompted this entire current discussion around the SDGs by the British Prime Minister Cameron and the Indonesian President Yudhoyono had 5 paradigm shifts that they suggested to achieve sustainable development. The first one was no one left behind. We are about to leave 40 million people behind. IDPs was fought very, very hard. You couldn't even mention it at the beginning. It is not a goal. It is not a target. We have in the indicators, despite lots and lots of efforts over a year now, not managed to put forced displacement into the core compendium of indicators. There is something on disaster-related displacement there. So there is a real chance, a possibility, that the Sustainable Development Goals and Framework, despite its many other positive successes, will leave 40 million people behind. Why? Partly because a year ago, when the working group, the member states, came out with their first draft, we looked at the draft and said, isn't this fantastic? They have fragility in there, and vulnerability, and risk reduction, and all these terms, exactly as Joel said, that we've gotten used to, that are also important. But we've started to forget about our core constituency. and that is internally displaced and others. And that has to do with some of this approach. So where to from here? If I can just look at three things. First of all, I do think that at the advocacy front, what we said around these the SDGs over the last year, with many of you on the podium here and others, we have mustered some energy around the recognition that this actually is a longer-term issue, a development and political issue first and foremost. The fear is if we leave IDPs out of the SDGs, that there will still be humanitarian money, but it'll be continuous, the same story, year in, year out, money for the humanitarian approach. There will not be enough money. There will not be prioritization of solving with developmental monies IDP solutions. The one thing that changed things around was the 17 years. Is the moment you started talking about 17 years, people woke up and said, 17 years, that is a developmental problem. That is an institutional problem. That is a peace goal-related problem. So I think the way that advocacy can work, and what we're trying to do right now is, and we've proposed this to a number of states, to say, if we assume that at the end of September at the summit will adopt a largely transformative sustainable development goals framework, we can also assume that IDPs will be left out. But we have a responsibility to maintain that momentum, not just to say, well, sorry, we lost that fight. So we're saying there will be 17 SDGs, 17 goals. We will propose an alternative 18th. An 18th, SDG 18. That's our campaign for the next 15 years. By 2030, we will spell out a goal that says we will commit to reducing 50% of the number of the internally displaced by 50% by 2030. We will have targets, we have socioeconomic indicators, and we will monitor this. And for the one reason, first and foremost, we need to get out of this narrative and the logic that we also have bought into, of every year waiting for the latest IDMC figures. So it's 33 million then, or 25 million before, 33 million then, 38 million then, and with some absurd excitement, we're sitting there right now and say next year it's probably going to be even higher. But where's the reduction of? Where's the reversal of that logic? What are we doing to reverse that logic? We need to force ourselves to give ourselves targets to reverse that. What is it that is necessary in a concrete context, programmatically, where you have 1.5 million IDPs, to say over the range of 3 to 5 years, what does it take to reduce the number from 1.5 to 1.2? Who has the mandate? Who has the comparative advantage? Who needs to intervene with governments on policies? Who can build the housing solutions for integration? Where can they be resettled? A comprehensive approach. That also means that humanitarians, we ourselves, need to look at how we work programmatically very differently. We're still annual, very annual, and where we have tried multi-year plans, we quite frankly don't know how to do multi-year plans. We haven't done real multi-year plans where you have flexible benchmarks and clear outcomes and so on. It's multiple, 3 years, the same projectized annual work plans that we put out. So we need to look at ourselves and do certain things differently. And meeting the needs in protracted crisis is not enough. So the way we have defined success so far, meeting the needs, that leads actually to us over the course of 10 years, giving more and more and more aid to the individual. All the figures that we have suggest that in the course of a protracted crisis, displacement in particular, the individual aid amounts received grow, balloon out of control. At the same time, developmental monies, investments, and the monies that affected governments themselves put into these issues dramatically go down. That cannot be the objective, that humanitarians do development on the cheap in a way, on an annual approach. So we need to accept that reality that 80% of our business happens in protracted areas, in protracted crisis, and work accordingly over 3 and 5 year plans with other actors together towards a goal that aims at not just meeting the needs, but reducing that vulnerability, reducing that need. And as the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees recently said, to get out of this logic of us perpetuating aid dependency and stand in the way of promoting self-reliance. I probably stop here, but I think this point of us ourselves needing to do much, much more to redefine and redefine success, what it is that we're actually doing, that giving more assistance to IDPs in these places cannot be the solution that we're aiming at, is an important policy shift that we need to buy in, that we need to think through. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jörg. Lots of different issues, lots of suggestions, challenges, work that's been done that remains to be done. We'll open the floor now for discussion, questions, maybe take 2 or 3 at a time. We have somebody with microphones. I think we have somebody with microphones. Questions,
No.
comments?
No question? Yes, good.
Yeah. They're going to come all and
Afternoon syndrome.
we'll do 1, 2, 3. Kamal, if you could introduce yourself, please.
I'm Kemal Kirişçi, a senior fellow here at Brookings. Hans-Jörg, you made references to 1991 crisis when more than 2 million, I think it was, Kurds fled to Iran and or the Turkish. I'd like to raise an and maybe politically incorrect issue.
Can you move the microphone a little bit closer?
I wonder if one should not go back and have another look at what happened in the Turkish case. Because with Beth, in October 2013, we were at a seminar in Ankara, and the minister who was responsible for handling this crisis on the Turkish side was saying Turkey made a huge mistake by adopting the open border policy on this particular occasion. The world had changed, obviously, in between significantly. But when we go back and look at 95, that crisis was resolved within not months, weeks. And refugees were able to return to northern Iraq, and subsequently KRG emerged in the long run. I wonder what the world would have, or Syria, and this crisis would have looked like if the minister's advice was followed by the current Turkish government. I know it's an uncomfortable question, but I have a question to Niels too. The Turkish government keeps saying that they have spent $6.5 billion on assisting the Syrian refugees. But we were, again, in the border area just about 2 weeks ago. And what we also came to see is the amount of economic activity that is occurring along the Syrian border on the Turkish side. Is there a study that looks at the contribution that assisting refugees in Turkey and assisting IDPs across the border in Syria is having on the Turkish side, meaning including like taxes that are being levied on humanitarian into Syria to try to counterbalance this incessant argument that Turkey is spending these huge sums of money and the international.
Thank you, Kamal. We'll take a couple more. The gentleman in the last row.
Hello, my name is John Wilder. I work with AMAR-US, an NGO operating on the ground in Iraq and Lebanon, assisting IDPs and other at-risk populations. Firstly, I want to thank you all not just for an excellent presentation, but for your work on behalf of this path-breaking project for the past 21 years. My question is specifically for Mr. Harold, although I would appreciate the insights of any of the other panelists as well. The contrast between development assistance and humanitarian relief is often emphasized. And you've pointed out the focus in terms of shifting the focus towards development assistance when it comes towards development assistance when it comes to IDPs. However, do you believe that it could be more productive to focus on ways to merge the mandates of humanitarian relief and development assistance rather than focusing on the differences between them in terms of because that could help cooperation between the various stakeholders?
Thank you. And we'll, Shelley down here in front.
Joel.
Shelley.
Just I've taken note, obviously, but the last talking point that I've got for the Standing Committee is that of the 7.6 million IDPs in Syria, 4.8 million are located in hard-to-reach areas. So I mention that not in defense of UNHCR, because I think that perhaps what you said has an element of truth, although I also see here that more than 120,000 people have benefited from protection interventions. Now, what those are, psychosocial support, legal assistance, counseling, principally in Damascus and the rural areas around Damascus, but still it gets to the issue of how much can we do if we're not secure ourselves, if we're not safe, if we don't have access. And that's a particular challenge in IDP situations, perhaps even more so than refugee situations historically, although nowadays we see as well on the Nigerian border, for example, where the conflict is everywhere, where the risk of an incident, of a security challenge from a non-state actor, Boko Haram or whatever, or from one of the armies, puts everybody at risk. So the question is, whether it's UNHCR or OCHA or another organization or consortium, how do we bridge that gap between the 4.8 and the 7.6 in the hard-to-reach areas in situations like Iraq, Syria, South Sudan? It would have been nice if Francis Deng was here to answer that one. South Sudan, Central African Republic, where we're just ourselves at risk.
Thanks. I think we'll add in Louise, and then we'll turn to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Louise, a recent graduate of a master's program at Georgetown University. And my question was, in sort of thinking forward about innovative solutions and better coordination, we've heard a lot about the dangers of mainstreaming IDPs into oblivion, but at the same time, when you look at the types of complex emergencies, for example, in northern Iraq, you have these sort of arbitrary categories of Syrian refugees in one bucket, and then Iraqi IDPs in another, and different UN agencies or different development agencies doing similar types of work, but specifically working for IDPs or specifically working for refugees, and that creates a lot of confusion and overlap of work and efforts. Is it better to say all of these people have the same types of needs, we'll assist them all in a coordinated fashion, or to continue to have these types of labels? Thank you.
Okay, a number of questions here on the Turkish government policy in 1991. A particular question about looking at some of the economic benefits of humanitarian assistance. A study's been done. I think that was to you, Niels. Question about merging development and relief organizations rather than trying to improve relations between them. The issues of access and these hard-to-reach numbers of IDPs. And then the question about should we move toward less of a focus on labels and just looking at needs? Who would like to jump in?
I can
Niels.
start. On the issue of Turkey, no, we are not, well, I don't know, maybe some others are, but from the bank's perspective, we are not involved in any study of the trade issues and so on. But what the Turkish government has asked us to do recently is to do an assessment of labor market implications of the presence of a large amount of Syrians in Turkey, so that the Turkish government can consider what they want to do with their labor market legislation and framework once the study is done. We have, from the bank side, a number of other impact assessments going on in different parts of the world about the social and economic impact of displacement, which is also new. This was never really done before in the bank. The bank does a lot of impact assessments of all types of things, but has not until recently started doing work on the implications of conflict-induced forced displacement. And when the result of this comes out, we hope that this can sort of position the bank to have some messages to the World Humanitarian Summit. So that's that one. The other one, merging the humanitarian and development mandates. I don't think that necessarily is the solution. I think the common wisdom, if you can call it that, at the moment is that we all in it from the beginning, but we have different things that we are good at. And that in itself, I mean, I think those of us that have been involved in this for decades, we've said it. But I think that things are beginning to happen also that indicates that what does it then mean? And it means that the bank, for instance, would start in a new crisis or when a window of opportunity arises in a protracted situation to do what it's better at than others, and that's normally sort of analytical work and benchmarking and stuff like that. And when it gets longer, then it can be reorienting existing operations, and in a longer term again, designing new development operations, because it takes the time it takes. So I think recognizing that we're all in it from the beginning, and that we have different things to do is more important, and to make that work, or to act accordingly is more important than merging mandates. But above it all, I think, I referred to it earlier, the mindset change. Because I've been grappling myself for decades, why is it so difficult for this relief to development transition to happen? And I'm not sure I have the 101, but one of the issues is that there seems to be some phobia amongst many to understand that it is a longer-term issue and what this implies. It implies that it is more than humanitarian. So this mindset change is critical, because from a development perspective, it's difficult for development actors to assist governments if their policy environment the political space is not there. And if the government holds a short-term policy and views on an issue, it's difficult to have long-term discussions. So that, I think, is a challenge that needs to be overcome.
Hans-Jörg and then Joel.
Yeah, first of all, on the issue of Iraq, I mean, I don't want to comment on what Turkey believes of its own policies, but the point that I was making is not a judgment of what was right or what was wrong. It was a point of fact that because of what happened there, because of the pictures and so on, that this motivated the Secretary General at the time to say, we need to look at a larger coordination issue around, or coordination structure around internal displacement. I mean, that was the point, and that was the birth hour, in a way, of ERC and that humanitarian system that we got to know over the last 25 years. The point on, quickly on who is responsible, well, on the ground, the good or the bad answer is it's the humanitarian coordinator, and who is ultimately who the buck stops with. But we also have very different quality of leadership and backgrounds and skills among humanitarian coordinators. And we do have coordinators who have more of an understanding that they need to address some of those specific issues and needs of IDPs, and others take more or facilitate more of that vulnerability and delivery approach. So it strikes me that unless we want to totally remodel and recraft the system that we have with all its consequences and a large effort, I personally don't believe that this is the time politically to look at major remodeling of mandates. Rather, we need to look at improved management structures and systems of working together. We might actually risk undermining and weakening the mandates that we have. So that's where I think we need to look at. On the issue of, very quickly, the mixed context, I can see, Shelley, on IDPs and refugees. Obviously, both HCR, OCHA, and others have recognized that as a problem. And it's not an easy issue, but I think some good progress actually has been made over the last 2 years in recognizing this and finding some operational solutions. High Commissioner Guterres himself, Valerie Amos, and now Stephen O'Brien are very much involved in this. But this is reversing an interpretation of mandates throughout big structures and organizations that have grown over 50 years. So it doesn't happen just in a few minutes. I'm just saying there are also areas where I think the agencies themselves recognize that they need to do better, and they're trying to come to solutions. That I would say as a positive example. Last point is on the humanitarian development, whatever we call this. I don't like the characterization of the divide. I mean, the first thing that I keep on saying is this is not an attitudinal issue. And I do believe there may, of course, be on all sides be attitudes and whatever it is. But the main issue for me is that the mechanics of these two sectors, in a way, don't speak to each other. Let me give you one example. We have in the Sahel, the humanitarians have tried to have a 3-year, multi-year plan for 9 countries. For the same 9 countries, the UNDAF CCA process is all over the map. So it's not for the same 3 years, but in one place where we have, say, the SRP, the humanitarian plan for the next 3 years, from 2015 to 2018, you may find that a CCA goes from 2010 to 2015. In the next country, it starts in 2012 and goes to 2018. In the next country, it starts in 2015 and runs through 2020. There is a disconnect. This extends to financial tools and financial mechanisms. It goes to our planning mechanisms. It goes to the way we do share analysis when we go into a crisis. And lastly, I believe that we just don't go into these situations sharing an objective, an operational objective, like the one I mentioned before. By over the next 3 or 5 years, by how much do we want to reduce food security? By how much do we want to reduce the number of displaced? And then if you go even further, neither humanitarian nor development actors actually work overarching over 10 to 15-year time frames to common goals. We don't have that even. You know, the longest planning framework that we have collectively owned around the United Nations is 5 years long. Now, from everything that we know is fragility is not addressed within 5 years. It requires 10 to 15 years. But we also know that as much as protracted is the new normal and urban is the new normal, fragility will be the new normal. 80% of our work will be in fragile countries, not necessarily conflicts, but fragile countries. So we need to look at some of our mechanics and tools and the way we work together, which are insufficient. And the point that Niels made, a common operational objective aimed at reducing need, reducing some of that vulnerability, matched up with comparative advantages. And there's some tough choices to be made. Not every UN organization has a comparative advantage. In some instances, international organizations shouldn't even be thinking that they have the comparative advantage. We need to start investing in first responder capacities, in municipalities, in some of those that actually carry it forward. Huge issues around the funding that may be mobilized and that donors do not want to go to. So that the complications, I think, there may be attitudinal issues, but the complications are in the mechanics of how these two sectors work very differently together. And then the last point, and Izumi Nakamitsu, my colleague from UNDP, would remind all of us right now that the issue of politics, that's neither humanitarian nor development. And I do believe that we haven't had the focus, as I said earlier, on political solutions, on political investments, on how many times has the issue of policy shifts for a government been on the speaking points of a foreign minister when going to some of these countries that we talk about. How many times? Very little. How many times has it been on the speaking points of the ERC? Sometimes. And is it coordinated? So there is a lot more that we ourselves can do and need to do to address some of those underlying and longer term causes. Thanks.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, so on the merging, I pretty much agree with what Niels and Hans-Jörg said. I mean, basically, the way I would put it is, I like we're all in it from the beginning, but we have complementary roles. And the key is to have joint planning that recognizes the individual strengths and plays down the weaknesses of everyone who's trying to respond. So you build on you need a development intervention. Well, go to the people who are actually effective at doing that. You're not going to turn ICRC into a development organization, nor would you want to. You want them to be the bastion of the Geneva Conventions and looking at IHL violations and so on. But again, where we fail, I think, is we fail to join up. And we fail to think strategically, and that's what we need to do better, whether it's in Lebanon or South Sudan or wherever. Now, on UNHCR and the Syria situation, I mean, in a way, I fell into the trap that Hans-Jörg mentioned of focusing on delivery, and obviously, 4.8 million people are hard to reach. That's a collective responsibility, and it's fundamentally the responsibility of the parties to the conflict. However, what we found on the Syria peer review is that there wasn't a joined-up advocacy strategy that was looking at what should be done globally and by whom around the violations of IHL and the hard-to-reach areas. And then what could be done from an advocacy perspective at the national level within Syria, perhaps joining up with actors in the other hubs in Gaziantep and Amman. And here, again, I do unfortunately insist that the need for UNHCR to maintain a good relationship with the Syrian government in the context of the protection that they need to provide to the Iraqi refugees hampers their ability to develop an aggressive and far-reaching advocacy agenda, even for the issues that are within Syria. We don't expect UNHCR, any other individual agency, to start, doing a global campaign on barrel bombing. But there are issues that can be worked on within Syria, such as documentation, which has been lost in the conflict. And what we found in the Syria OPR is that operational peer review, even though this is recognized as an issue, there's not a joined up strategy around that. And again, if my point is simply, let's be context specific. And if it's not possible for a particular agency to develop and drive a protection advocacy agenda in a particular location, then let's give space to some other body or entity to do that. So I think we've kind of, I'm all for reinforcing mandates, but we've kind of ended up in a bit of a trap in some circumstances where mandates become the be-all and end-all, and we're not thinking creatively about what can actually be done that will make a difference to people, and that's what we have to start doing.
Thanks. Alfredo?
I'm not sure if I am going to answer some of the questions, but I'm going to answer some of the inputs here.
Okay.
Imagine, Hans-Jörg, imagine a situation in 10 years' time when IDMC is going to report a significant decline in internal displacement by conflict. I will personally be very happy to do that, to report that. But that will require some substantial effort by UN bodies, national governments, structures. It can be done. But also, the situation is more complex than that. It's not only to prevent displacement from happening, because internal displacement can also save lives. Mm-hmm. People need to move sometimes, and the situation in Syria is mentioned. One of the things that we have observed is that in 90% of the 60 countries that we have analyzed for this fantastic report that you can find online, the Global Overview on Internal Displacement. In 90% of the 60 countries that we analyzed, there was displacement occurring in more than 10 years. So they have observed displacement for more than 10 years in 90% of those 60 countries. So then if people are internally displaced for a long time, they will try to find solutions in one place, in the second place, in the third place. If they don't find solutions during that road, you will see that the first internal displacement movement is a start or trajectory of displacement. At some point, people will also make a decision, I need to cross a border. I need to move on. So then we are talking about human mobility. And the longer people stay displaced, you will have those people who will make that decision, or someone will make that decision for them. You need to go. So therefore, it is imperative that we need to find solutions both to address the push factors, but also to help national government to assist those who are displaced. And we need also to identify those who are not fleeing. We are very focused on the big numbers, but one example is the Aboriginal Indians in the Amazonas. They cannot flee. They are under the threat of extinction because they are confined in those small territories. So I know that these are controversial issues to compare that with internal displacement, but there's also a threat by the human rights violations. So we need to see that sometimes displacement saves lives, and we need to see the whole thing and address it properly. It's not only to reduce the numbers, but it's to find the good solutions for those people who are in terrible situations.
I realize, well, we didn't address the labels issue, and I don't think we can or should get away from the labels. I mean, to be a refugee carries with it a set of rights that are internationally recognized by the Refugee Convention, and there's just, again, there's no way around that, nor should there be. So we're never going to be in a situation where it's just a mass of undifferentiated, vulnerable people because of the particular status that's carried through refugee status.
Beth, can I just
Very briefly, and then let's take one more.
no, just a very quick. I mean, just want to clarify. I very much agree with what you said. I mean, my point simply is to reverse the logic. We need to make a bigger effort to actually use opportunities. And if we're in situations, those 90% that you mentioned, where protracted displacement has happened and has been the case for over 10 years and going and so on, I think it's also an obligation for us to seek more actively solutions, whatever they may be, integration, reintegration, and so on, and operationally act. So who provides the housing solutions? And that's where things very often fall short. It's easier, it's more comfortable, and it's a perfect storm almost. It works for everyone, for many of the donors, for the host governments, and for agencies to continue the delivery footprint that we've had, even considering everything that you said. And that's my point, that we need to find a vehicle around the dynamic and the momentum that the SDGs provide to say we also need to think differently about a reduction, possibilities of reduction, not only of numbers, of the fate of these people caught in these situations. Let's use that momentum, let's use that opportunity.
Okay, let's have another round of questions. This gentleman here, one, and then Patricia, and then Susan. If you could stand up, introduce yourself, and...
John Rothenberg, consultant, former UNHCR employee. I'm wondering if the problem isn't the tension between the two mandates, as opposed to the problem of having to deal with to be accepted by a government that in most cases is the one that's causing the IDPs in the problem, and so you have a tension of trying to not be kicked out at the same time as you're dealing with the problem.
Thank you. Patricia?
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. I think this has been a very good panel and a very thoughtful panel. Everybody at the everybody sitting has been trying to grapple with reality and the disconnect between mandates and the realities that the mandates are supposed to address, and an acceptance across the board that problems are more long-term than the mandates were that international organizational mandates were supposed to grapple with, that the protracted nature of displacement, the protracted nature of refugees, the development demands in order to integrate, in order to achieve integration, are all really beyond the capacity of any one international organization. You've all said quite correctly, I agree, that we should be each doing what we can do best and we should collaborate more. Now, the missing actor, which everybody's implied but isn't really talked about much, is the government. The government locally, the government regionally, the government nationally. And so it's obviously, in a long term, it is the government which will be the governments, the various levels of governments, which will be in charge of implementing all of the good things that international organizations want to help them to implement. So I'm wondering if in your cases, have you done more strategizing about how your organizations or how in general the international community can work more effectively with governments, including bad governments like the Syrian government? I mean, that's really the big challenge.
Thank you. We have Susan Martin. Just stand up, Susan, sorry.
This is primarily for Hans Zurich, but others may want to answer it. You've emphasized the SDGs in the September summit. Could you talk a little bit about whether the World Humanitarian Summit will be an opportunity to revitalize the focus on IDPs and also thinking about both the access issues that we've been talking about as well as the solutions?
Okay, is there one more question? Briefly, yes.
From the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, I really like this noble goal of measuring operational effectiveness by setting a goal of reduction for the number of IDPs. But I'm just wondering about the mechanics of this. This is going to be really, really hard, especially for the countries, the national governments who dismiss the issue of IDPs or who label the issue in mysterious ways. Instead of calling them IDPs, they will call them migrants or guests and so on. So I'm just wondering about the mechanics of how are we going to maintain and measure the effectiveness of reduction of IDPs when the governments are going to work around the labeling and call them in mysterious ways.
Okay, so we have questions about the labeling again, questions about the role of government when government causes the problem, how to work with good governments and governments that aren't so good, and a specific question about the World Humanitarian Summit. Will IDPs be on the agenda there? Who'd like to begin? Okay, Hans-Jörg?
Yes, I mean, I should have started with the World Humanitarian Summit. No, look, the World Humanitarian Summit is of course an opportunity, but we need to get there by not just highlighting an issue that people have known about for 25 years. So to go there and say, look, displacement is a real issue. We now have 38, or who knows how many we will have, you will know, by the time of the summit next year. That's not enough to highlight this. So we need to go with more. And it needs to be something strong that will last for another 10 or 15 years. And so what we're thinking of is exactly along those lines that I just suggested, that we need to even think through in this area of violence, conflict, displacement, protection, about a certain measurability. It can be done. We just haven't put our mind as much to it as we have on food, water, and some of the commodities. That's the point. Is it easy? No, it's not easy. Is it, do I believe that by 2030 we will be able to reduce the number of IDPs by 50%? I don't believe in this. But we need to put a different logic into what we're doing, and we need to prompt some reporting and some refinement of what the obstacles are. This has led, for example, around the MDGs to a whole industry and very different understanding of the depth of development, because the MDGs, did people believe that all the MDGs would be fulfilled by 2015? They didn't believe that. that hunger would be halved, and also they didn't believe this. But by putting this as a goal out there, they prompted a whole industry to think very differently about this. The Zero Hunger Challenge is one such idea to say this can be reduced, and we need to get a similar logic into this. So I think for me, there is around displacement, there's a continuity, that's what I should be saying, from Sendai, where we fought very hard to get IDPs into it, via the SDG towards the World Humanitarian Summit. You mentioned access very clearly, the same thing. We've been pushing for a number of years right now some work that looks at what we call arbitrary denial of access. Walter and others have been part of this, where we say, look, of course it's the number one task of humanitarians to negotiate access. But at some point, when fundamental commodities like food, water, medicines are not only blocked, they're actually specifically taken off trucks before they cross lines. In order to harm civilians, we need to look for an next step. That needs to be a finding of something being arbitrary, and there needs to be a consequence to this type of behavior, because there's a consequence for those people on the ground. They die, suffer, and so on and so forth. So there needs to be a consequence. That is something that will also peak at the World Humanitarian Summit. Last point is again on the solutions. I mean, I think it goes to your question. Is it easy? No, it's not going to be easy. But if for 10 years, 15 years, we keep people in some, even if it's only 1/3 of all the displaced who are in camps still, but to keep people for 10, 15 years nourished in shelter in camps on an annual response cycle, and then you see these camps like Zamzam camp from 2003 to now turn into medium-sized cities. But our approach to that is not to treat them as a socioeconomic entity, as a medium-sized city of 150,000, 130,000 people. We treat them as a humanitarian caseload. That's what is wrong. And whether the answer is integration, reintegration, resettlement, or return depends on the situation. I'm not saying that everyone, and it's an impossible solution, we need to keep these people in these terrible situations unless they can return. There are also political implications, of course, but we need to think outside of the box. Keeping people for 10, 15, 20 years in these types of situations, for me, is irresponsible. And we contribute to that on a daily basis. That's my plea for rethinking and for looking at a more reduction agenda.
Thank you. Joel, would you like to comment on any of the questions?
Just very quickly, on the question of governments, I mean, I think the fact is that the vast majority of the world's governments, for the most part, actually do try to take care of their people. So, I think we shouldn't let the Syrias of the world define what it means to work with government. So I agree with you that there's a huge scope, say, for example, in the context of the Kampala Convention, that's where the whole legal support, capacity development, and so on agenda starts to come in. I mean, on Syria, I think it's really very difficult. What my experience is, the further you get to the base, the more you find government officials who are in touch with the people and may actually still care. But I mean, you cannot change the fact that the national government in Syria is committing major human rights violations on a daily basis that are well documented. And I think it's just it really is an impossible situation that the groups are in that are working inside Syria. I mean, there is a surreal aspect to it. And I mean, I won't go into the details, but I mean, when a government official, a senior government official tells you that they don't initiate any offensive operations, it's all defensive. I mean, you're in Alice in Wonderland, or you're in a Kafkaesque situation where what does it even mean to talk to a national government that's denying that they're using barrel bombs, as Assad has done on several occasions on international TV. So I just I mean, I actually have spent a fair amount of my career liaising with governments that most of the world considers nasty, but I think the Syrians are almost beyond the pale at the national level.
Niels, Alfredo, last comments?
No, I have nothing to add now.
Since I have the pleasure to be the last one on the panel, I would like to say that on behalf of, let me say something so pompous, on behalf of those millions of internally displaced that your work has benefited, it has counted. And so you have done, at Brookings, you have done a fantastic job. You have been the pioneer in all these years. Advance, we have heard during these two panels, advance a significant amount of work. We are in the position that we can have all these open conversations and on very difficult things, and that it is the benefit of this pioneer work that you have done. And it will benefited millions of people before this situation and this today, and it will benefit millions in the future. So thank you to you, Elizabeth, and thank you to Brookings and everyone who has been part of this project.
Well, thank you to the panelists, and thanks to all of you. Now, please join us just right across the hall for a small reception. It won't be very long. I know it is Friday evening, but we appreciate the chance.
That's when it should be long.